Good morning and welcome back to another virtual edition of Children's Church. Today, we are hopping back into our first Samuel series, and we have already learned so many things, but it's been a few weeks, so we're gonna have to go back and try to jog our memories as to some of the important things that have happened so far. And we have so many great stories coming up in our first Samuel series. And today is no exception because we're going to hear a story that is pretty intense. It has victories and failures, war, fear, everything in between. There's a lot of stuff going on today. So I hope you're ready for a great story. Let's get to it. Let's start with our recap of everything that's happened in 1 Samuel so far, or at least the highlights. So Samuel, obviously, is an important guy here. He is a prophet, which means that he hears special messages from God and then delivers those messages to God's people. And as a prophet in Israel, Samuel was seen as an important leader. But he wasn't like a king that, was calling all the shots, making all the decisions, gathering armies and all that kind of stuff. He was more like somebody who the people would go to for wisdom and advice. And he helped kind of steer them in the direction that God wanted them to go. But as Samuel was getting older and older, though the people loved him because, Samuel really loved God and followed after God, they weren't huge fans of his sons who didn't exactly love God in the same way. And so the people decided that they needed a new leader. And they wanted this leader to be different than Samuel. They wanted this leader to be a king. And this made Samuel super sad and God very sad because of the people's reason for wanting a king. They wanted a king so that they could be like all the other nations around them. They wanted to look like those other nations that really didn't love God or follow God at all. They followed other false gods and did awful things, but they wanted a king just like those nations. And they thought that having a king like those other nations would be a way to make sure that they could stay safe, to keep other enemies away and have the best, most comfortable life possible. But they didn't really care what God had to say about the matter, and they just wanted to do their own thing. So Samuel, he decided to do what the people asked him to do, even though it made him sad. And he was told by God that a man named Saul would be king. And so he actually told Saul about this, but the people didn't know at that point. And through a long story of cool things that happened, Saul ends up being king. Well, when Saul was chosen to be king, he was like hiding because he didn't really want to be king for whatever reason, and he was hiding in the trash heap. So the people had to pull him out of the trash, but sure enough, he became king, and the people thought he was great because he was a super, super tall guy, and they're like, yeah, let's have a tall guy that's strong and be a good leader that we can look up to, literally. And so the people were all for it. And Saul, he becomes king, and he has some victories in war right from the start, and that makes the people very excited. They think that they have secured for themselves the perfect king who will fight for them, defend them, and keep them safe and comfortable, and everything will be great and wonderful. And today, we're going to see Saul get put to the test when things don't exactly go the way he had planned them to go. Now, thankfully, the last time that Saul went to war, he was victorious against that really creepy guy with the eyeballs. Yeah, not having any of that. Well, Saul, he knows that it's only a matter of time until another enemy rises up against Israel. So he decides to build an army, a very large army, that him and his son, Jonathan, are going to have control over. Now, Jonathan, he's going to be a very important person later on, and he's kind of important today. But yeah, we'll learn more about him later. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 13, and we're going to start at verse 2. All right, let's get to it. Saul, King Saul, he chose 3,000 men of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the people he sent home, every man to his tent. So King Saul, he has gathered a new army out of Israel. There are 3,000 men in this army, which is a lot of people, but not nearly as much as some of the other countries we'll come to find. But 2,000 of the men are with him, and 1,000 of the men are with Jonathan. And it's Jonathan and his troops that are going to be causing a bit of a war to break out. It's a little bit of a battle, all right? So this is verse 3. Jonathan, he was in war. Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. Now, garrison, that's kind of like the troops, like, you know, the men that are all in the army kind of thing. So he defeated some of the troops that were in Geba, some of those Philistines. And Saul, when King Saul heard about it, blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all Israel heard it, and said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become a stench to the Philistines, and the people were called out to join Saul at Gilgal. Things seem to be going well for Israel. I mean, Jonathan and his men have just defeated some Philistine troops, some of the enemy over at Gibeah, I believe it was called, and they are super excited about it. Saul is telling everyone about it, blowing the trumpet, shouting out their victory to all the land of Israel, and they have a reason to celebrate. But they also have started to not be well liked by the Philistines. It says they became a stench, or like a really bad smell to the Philistines, because the Philistines, they did not like Israel, especially since they were defeating some of their troops. That's why I'm standing outside of the stenchiest room in the building, the ladies' room. The Philistines were ready to retaliate against Israel after that embarrassing defeat over in Gibeah. Now, we were told that Israel had, 3,000 men that fought in their army. That sounds like a lot of people. So let's see how it compares to the Philistines.
So the Philistines, they're angry, they're ready to go to war, so they muster up all of their armies together, and it turns out that they had...
Let's start with the chariots. They had 30,000 chariots. Now, chariots, if you don't know this, they're kind of like those big wagons that are pulled by horses, and this was a way to show your strength when it came to battle. This was like the equivalent of today's nuclear weapons to see how strong someone is. The chariots, they allowed men to be elevated away from other men, being pulled by horses, and it just allowed them to fight a whole lot easier than anybody who was on the actual ground. All right, so 30,000 chariots compared to 3,000 men.
That's not looking too good.
But, you know, God will be on Israel's side, right? So it's not hopeless, is it? Let's see what else they had to bring to the table. So the Philistines, they also had 6,000, double Israel, 6,000 men on horses. Now, these men, again, would be elevated in the air and at a much greater advantage to fight against anybody who's just standing on the ground, no matter what their armor was or what their weapons were. Can you imagine? Horses are big. Have you ever been next to a horse? Horses can be really big. I don't want to be in the way of a horse. I don't care if we're in battle or not.
If a horse is coming at me,
game over. Watch out. All right, so not looking too great. But then the Philistines also just had their normal men in battle, just like the regular ground soldiers. And this is how scripture puts it for us. It says in verse 5 of chapter 13 that they had troops like the sand of the seashore. The sand of the seashore, that is
a lot of soldiers. Yeah. This ain't looking too good.
The Israelites were scared to death. They heard all these things about the Philistines, and they went running and hiding. They knew that this was not going to turn out well. They hid in houses, in caves, in holes in the ground, wherever they could find.
What do we do now?
Hold your breath.
Hold my breath? What do you mean?
Some people probably even hid in the trash heap, just like King Saul did right before he was chosen to be king. Everybody in Israel was very scared. Everybody. Even King Saul. He was terrified. And then he realized that he hadn't actually sought after the favor of the Lord. Or how else can I put that? He hadn't asked God to, help him and Israel so that they wouldn't die from the Philistines, just saying. So he decided that they should make a sacrifice to God. But there was a little bit of a problem. They needed Samuel, the prophet, in order to make that sacrifice, to follow God's law, how he wanted it to be made. But Samuel, he said he would be there in 7 days, and he wasn't showing up. We're jumping back into 1 Samuel chapter 13, starting at verse 8, all right? Here we go. He, King Saul, waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from King Saul. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me, and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. So King Saul, he decided, you know what, since Samuel isn't showing up, I'm just going to make these sacrifices to God because we need God to be pleased with us so he can fight on our side and we can defeat these Philistines who we are scared to death of. But something unexpected happened next. So verse 10, it says, as soon as Saul had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. Figures, if he had just waited a little bit longer. So Saul went out to meet and greet him, and Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the time that you had appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash," or they had come together at Michmash. Michmash, I love that name, Michmash, I like that. "I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, 'You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel for forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue.'" There once was a boy named Johnny. Hi, I'm Johnny. And Johnny had a dad, and today was his birthday. Oh no, I forgot to get my dad a birthday gift. So Johnny had to think to himself, what should I get him? And then he remembered his dad's favorite thing in the whole world, Airheads. And so Johnny decided to go to the store to get some Airheads. But on his way to the store, Johnny ran into a problem. There was a road between him and the Airheads, and this road was a very busy road. So Johnny thought to himself, what am I going to do? Because I know that my dad told me that I should never cross a busy road by myself, but the Airheads are over there. So Johnny decided to cross the road anyways. And he got his dad an Airhead. And he went back to his dad. Now, do you think that his dad was very happy with Johnny or not happy at all? Hopefully happy, but I don't think he's gonna be, because I disobeyed him, even though I tried to get him something. I think that Johnny's situation is actually very similar to King Saul's situation. So Johnny's dad had a birthday, and Johnny wanted to give him a gift, which is a good thing. So Johnny decided to go to the store to get his dad Airheads. There's nothing wrong with this. This is a great idea for a present. But on his way there, he realized that there was a busy road between where he was and where the store was. And Johnny made a decision to cross that busy road even though his dad had specifically told him not to cross busy roads by himself. But Johnny did it anyways. So we could imagine that when Johnny got back and gave his dad those Airheads, and then he found out that Johnny had been crossing those busy, dangerous roads by himself, that his dad would not be happy with him at all because Johnny went against his dad's rules. He did not obey his father. Well, King Saul, he also thought that it would make God very happy to do a sacrifice for him, to, honor and worship him. And that's true. God is pleased with those sacrifices. He is pleased when his people worship him. However, in order to do this, King Saul decided to break a big rule. God had made it very clear that Samuel was the only one who could make these special burnt offerings. But King Saul decided to do it anyways. And he thought that God would be happy with him. But God wasn't happy with him because Saul was not obedient. He did not follow God's rules and what God wanted him to do. And because of that, Saul had some huge consequences. Saul quickly found out that his throne was not going to continue on for forever, which is normally how things happen. You know, if you're a king, you have a son, and your son becomes a king, and then his son becomes the king after him, and so on and so forth. Well, this kingdom was going to end with Saul. His son Jonathan would not become king, but rather God was going to choose somebody else to become king, and it would be through that other person that the throne would continue on from generation to generation. You might say that Saul was in the doghouse. That joke was the cream of the crop. Let's just say these jokes come at a dime a dozen. Dozen? Get it? Dozen? I better candy stop while I'm ahead. I'm sure you're all green with envy from all of the jokes that I'm dishing out. Dishing out dishes, like food dishes, grocery store. I need to stop. I'm gonna stop. Unfortunately, our story ends on a big bummer. So we have Israel scared to death, running and hiding because the Philistines are massively huge and tough and terrible and scary. And then you have King Saul, who disobeys God, even though he was trying to please God. And he gets this like horrible news about his family not being able to continue on as kings of Israel. And then we learn lastly, we haven't heard this yet, but in our story, it turns out that Israel, they give all their weapons up to the Philistines because they needed people to sharpen like their spears and stuff. And the Philistines happened to be people that worked with metal and did a lot of sharpening and whatnot. So the Israelites went to the Philistines in order to get their things sharpened for the war against the Philistines. Yeah, I don't see that working out well at all. So, everything is bad. Israel is hopeless. The end. Yeah, unfortunately, that's kind of where we're ending today, and I don't know where things are going to go from here because it just looks terribly hopeless. But this is our lesson for today. It's a big one, that we need to learn something from King Saul and from our fake person, Johnny, who's a stick figure. That's me! That was a little weird. But we do need to learn something today. We need to learn that we are never going to please our teachers, we're never going to please our parents, and ultimately, we're never going to please God if we are disobeying them. All right, so if we are not following what they've told us to do, then they're not going to be pleased with us. And even if we think that the outcome is going to be something good, if we're disobeying along the way to get to that good outcome, they're not going to be happy. Now, I want to focus in specifically on the God piece here, all right? That's the most important one of them all, though they're all important in their own different ways. But let's see. Even if you're doing something spiritual or religious that might seem like a good thing, if you're not following and obeying God along the way, God is not going to be pleased with whatever it is that you're doing. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you knew that God was telling you to give money to City Team, an organization that they help people in need, people that might be really hungry, that need food. They give out food and that kind of thing. So you knew that God was putting it on your heart. His Spirit was leading you to give your allowance, maybe it's your birthday money that you had saved up or money that you got over Christmas to City Team. But you thought to yourself, I don't really want to give that money over there. So you know what? Instead, I'm just going to read my Bible all week a lot. Now, is reading your Bible a good thing? Absolutely, it's an amazing thing. But if you are not following God and doing what he asks you to do, that's not a good thing. And it's true, and let me give you another example, the opposite way. Maybe God was telling you that you should go serve at City Team, that you should help give out food to people in need. But then you thought to yourself, that sounds kind of scary, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get there or how I'm supposed to do it, and it might be a little uncomfortable, and it might take a lot of time. So you know what? Instead, I'm just gonna take my money from my birthday or for Christmas or my allowance, and I'm going to give it to City Team instead of serving there. Now, is giving money to City Team a good thing? Absolutely, we just talked about that. But if God was leading you and telling you that you should be going and serving at City Team, then that means you're being disobedient to God. Just because you're doing something spiritual does not mean that you are necessarily following after God and being obedient. And if we are followers of God, we need to do that. Even when it seems scary or uncomfortable or new and different, we need to obey and follow God, no matter what it is that He is calling us to do. Of course, on the flip side, we know that when we do mess up and we fail, we can ask God for forgiveness, and He is very willing to forgive us. And we can't forget that part either. Well, I hope that you have a wonderful day, a great week, and, try really hard to make sure that you're being obedient this week, that you're obeying your parents, that you're obeying your teachers, and ultimately that you're obeying God. And if you're obeying God, then you're going to be obeying your teachers and parents as well. So they all kind of go hand in hand with each other. But have an awesome week, and I hope to see you again next week. And hopefully our story turns something more positive than it did this week. But I'm not sure it's going to. See you guys. I was gonna keep making jokes, but I didn't want this video to be any grosser than it already was.